ADHD is kind of energy in your head and your being that is permanent. It's not an illness that comes on. It's a condition that you are.
Haig,
a world-renowned author and mental health advocate
who has sold over 10 million books worldwide.
Best known for writing Reasons to Stay Alive about his intense battle with depression.
His ADHD diagnosis is now helping him make sense of it all.
I'd gone from being one kind of nightmare boyfriend to the opposite kind of nightmare boyfriend. Before my breakdown, I was a nightmare because I was an addict who didn't realise was an addict. 2, couldn't go to the shop on my own.
What do you think is the difference between depression, stress, and anxiety?
Stress is basically what a lot of us feel a lot of the time, where things are just slightly out of alignment. When you've got proper capital A anxiety, you are suddenly in a state that you can't switch off. And depression is the point beyond that at which you feel like you've given up. So I would go through a period of anxiety, and then through sheer exhaustion, I'd reach a point which my brain sort of just fell into depression.
This episode is dedicated to anyone who loves long drives because you can hyperfixate on your latest obsession for hours. When was your first memory of feeling different?
My first memory, I've only ever felt a bit different. I've only ever felt like I've got a lot in my head, and as far back as I can remember, that struggle to make sure I'm being normal or fitting in with friends. I mean, during my primary school years, I moved school 2 or 3 times. Once just because my parents moved house, but the other time because I was struggling to fit in to the school. So that was a time where I thought, and my parents had to think that I was a bit different because teachers and other kids I wasn't getting on with and doing things. I used to be sort of more content in my own company when I was very little. I used to, make up games for myself and play games for myself. And I was obsessed. I don't think this is specifically an ADHD thing. It might be an autistic thing. I don't know. But on the back seat of my parents' car, I used to look at car headlights, and I would be able to identify, Peugeot 206, Ford Sierra, whatever it was. I would know just by looking at the headlights at night. And when I sort of like ever talked about things I did to other people, I was like, what are you on about, you weirdo? I don't do that. And stuff like that. And I was terrible at sport at school. And that was partly, I think, because I was always daydreaming. So I'd be the kid who'd have a football land on their head without having seen where that football was coming from. So I would realise, in fact, I was in a football team once. That was because I was at a school where the full population of the school was 28 people. And so they pretty much had everyone, boys, girls, everyone was in the team. But then at secondary school, I was told I was special needs in some subjects. I was a history teacher said I was special needs, and an art teacher said I was special needs. The history teacher, I think just because I was being a bit of a nuisance and being distracted and distracting other people. Art teacher, just because I was so messy at art. So can you remember when you used to have to do a colour wheel?
Of course, yeah.
Hardest thing in the world for me to keep in those lines on the colour wheel. So, she took me aside and said, we think you're special needs. But obviously, this was late 80s, early 90s. They didn't tell you what your special needs were. You were just special needs. So it was a very long process after that before finding out what your special needs are. And obviously a lot of it is nonsense. I mean, I was told, the first thing I was told I was special needs in was history, but I ended up doing a degree in history. And the other subject was art, and part of my history degree was history of art, and I love art. And so, even though I very much think people should find the right labels for them, I don't think labels should necessarily be barriers or, being told something can put you off it. Like being special needs, there was such stigma about being special needs at anything back in the 80s. It was just used as a slur. So, if I was given an option of that, like, please don't. My parents would get involved and say, oh, he's not special needs. And
Do you remember how you felt when they said that to you? When they said your special needs?
Yeah, it was one of those moments. It was, it was like being totally, I don't know, disillusioned or feeling strange, or I because as a kid especially, I mean, I think even so now, you kind of want to fit into an environment, but when you're at school, that's survival, isn't it? You desperately want to fit in, and I already had enough going against me in terms of fitting in, because I was at quite a tough school, but I was from quite, I had your standard sort of soft middle class family background. My mum was a teacher, my dad was an architect. I was at quite a tough school near Nottingham, and so I was very sort of like trying to fit in, quite sort of like downwardly mobile, shoplifting, getting into bits of trouble, and then you just want to be one of them, and then you're told, "Oh no, you're different." Yeah, it's horrible at that age.
You mentioned earlier you were trying to be normal, and I think that experience of trying to be normal is almost like such a headline for the neurodivergent community. Do you remember an early memory of accepting that you were different and therefore not trying to be normal?
Probably wouldn't be that early. I think I was very self-conscious throughout school. As I got a bit older, music helped because, you get to an age where it's cooler to be alternative in your tastes. And so it wasn't very easy always to articulate what I was feeling, but music gave me an outlet. So you'd like listen to The Cure or something and embrace being a bit different. And so I remember that around sort of 15, 16, 17 years old. I think, if I'm being brutally honest, it wasn't until I had a breakdown later on at the age of 24 where everything came to a head, and through that long, winding process of recovery, I had to find a way to accept myself, because otherwise it would have killed me, because I was headed down a route, suicidally depressed. So, I was in a very crisis situation. And this was years before I found out about neurodiversity. But I still had to accept the way I was. So even though I didn't know I was ADHD, I sort of realized who I was and stopped masking, even though I didn't see it in that language. But, for instance, when I recovered, I knew I'd have to find a way of working that worked for me. I'd had a winter of 9-to-5 office jobs, call center jobs, worked in media sales, doing stuff that I just found too incredibly difficult. And I've never had a job, a proper, inverted commas, job that lasted more than 3 weeks, I'd say. 3 weeks seemed to be my limit. So after that, I realized once I recovered from depression, I realized I had to do something that wouldn't break me down. And that probably involved, at that point, working from home. But this was years before Zoom and before the internet is what it is now. So working from home, there were limited options. So I ended up becoming a writer almost by a process of elimination of everything else that I couldn't do.
I know depression is a huge part of your journey. Heartbreakingly, it's such a reoccurring theme within the community. It's almost like a compounded effect of the years and years and years of feeling different. ADHD has a very clear definition medically. And if you picked up the DSM-5, it would say it's a neurodevelopmental disorder characterized by traits of impulsivity and forgetfulness and disorganization. It's very clear what it is medically, but speaking to people in the community and like yourself, it's very nuanced, it's very individualized. What does ADHD mean to you? And when was the first time you heard that acronym?
Well, I heard ADD. I think it was originally ADD, wasn't it? My mum was a head teacher, so she'd always be off on conferences. I think once she had a conference on ADD, and I think there was a kid at her school who had ADD. And my understanding of it was very extreme behaviors, very disruptive behaviors. And as with autism, it was something that I definitely wasn't. And certainly something about my mum, she possibly still has issues with thinking of me as such, but certainly then she would have definitely not considered I was neurodiverse. So I think I'd heard of ADD, but it wasn't massively on my radar. I'd heard of Ritalin, people on Ritalin, but it was very much, even though I knew I wasn't normal, I didn't think I was that. So just as in my head, autism was Rain Man, ADD was like the kid at my mum's school who got expelled, or it was like the always extreme. But I don't think this is just unique to neurodiversity. I went through depression before realizing I was depressed. I think there's a resistance sometimes to label ourselves, whether that's more common in men. Well, I think it is more common in men, isn't it? That we're a bit more reluctant to admit that, not that it's a problem, but there's a difference or condition.
Do you think you had an internalized prejudice towards those 4 letters, ADHD, before you became aware that you might be living with it?
Yeah, I felt I was one of those people that saw ADHD as something a little bit airy and not very well defined, and a character trait. So, like someone being a little bit ADHD. I was probably one of those people who thought that we're all a bit on the spectrum, but, it's not that serious. And what was ADHD? I put a lot of what my mind was going through down to anxiety. So like the pace of my mind, the distractibility, I put down to anxiety. The first diagnosis, mental health diagnosis I ever got, was panic disorder, because I was having full-blown panic attacks at that time. And so that simmered down to sort of generalized anxiety. And then that just sort of explained away everything else. And there's obviously an overlap, and I think even a causal relationship between anxiety and ADHD. But I think the diagnosis of ADHD just brought things into so much sharper focus when I eventually got it. It made so much sense and explained so much. And, I ticked off almost every criteria. And I think for people who don't understand what ADHD is and what the difference between having ADHD and being a bit distracted or being a bit bombarded by the internet or not knowing what to choose on Netflix is, ADHD is a kind of energy in your head and your being that is permanent. It's not a mood state. Obviously, you have fluctuations of mood and fluctuations of being able to handle it, but the ADHD itself, that's just you. And I think that's why it can be hard to recognize in yourself, because it's not an illness that comes on. It's a condition that you are. So you've never been anyone else. So it becomes your normal. And so it can be hard to recognize it. And with me, when I realized that I should possibly go for a diagnosis, it was my wife who'd been reading an interview with someone who was ADHD and said she might as well have been reading an interview with me because of what he was saying and certain problematic behavior he was talking about, which was a result of not having the right diagnosis and stuff. So that's when I thought, and also I'd been having therapy, and my therapist, even though it wasn't a psychiatrist who could diagnose me, suggested I go to a psychiatrist because a lot of what I was saying was leading him to that sort of layman's conclusion that I was ADHD.
No, your phone isn't solely to watch brilliant new episodes of ADHD Chatter. You can also download helpful apps on it too, like Tiimo app. Tiimo app is a perfectly tailored app designed specifically to help improve your organization. It's something I use every day to make my busy schedule manageable, and it works like a charm. Organizing a podcast, writing books, taking meetings, and running errands is so much to manage, you can end up getting overwhelmed and forgetting things. That is, if it weren't for the Tiimo app. And this is how. Tiimo is designed specifically to hack the neurodivergent way of thinking. We have a brain that might struggle with time agnosia, object permanence, memory cognitive load, task initiation anxiety, or procrastination. All things I also fall victim to. That is the ad read halftime whistle. Just a little more to go. The award-winning Tiimo app is the perfect life hacking tool to help your time management and kick you up the bum when you need it most. If you want to stay ahead of the competition, then the visual planning Tiimo app is specifically designed to help your structuring, organizing, focusing, and goal setting. It has a visual timer providing a tangible and visual representation of time to help users pace themselves so you never miss a deadline ever again. It also has an efficient lock screen reminder service to alert those of you who are very out of sight, out of mind, with your chores and afraid you might forget them. It brilliantly centers all of your tasks in one place to streamline your overflowing schedules and make them much more digestible and a lot less intimidating. And for those who find big tasks too overwhelming to even start, Tiimo breaks them down into more manageable subtasks to get the ball rolling. And if you think Tiimo won't improve your life, you're wrong. Without their sponsorship, we'd not be able to survive as a podcast. So in some ways, they already are. Back to the interview. Gosh, yeah, there's a lot there. That internalized energy you mentioned, just as you so perfectly said, it never stops. I'd describe it as the sort of 10 highly caffeinated squirrels continuously.
Yes, I like that, Alex.
Barreling around in there. And
don't tell my golden retriever about that energy, or he'll be chasing my mind.
It is, each one pulling you in a different direction with a different thought. And you can easily see how that can create that overwhelm. And that overstimulation that can sometimes just render you paralyzed physically.
Yes.
You can't move sometimes when that happens.
Yes. And this is the thing, like at school, one of the reasons I was considered a bit like slow or a bit special needs at school is because I'd often have my mouth open and look gormless and a bit dead-eyed. And people would think there's nothing going on there. And there's like everything going on in there. But the outer exterior was like a bit of a zombie face. And it wasn't an absence of stuff. It was a overabundance of stuff that I was thinking about and popping around. And, and this was before smartphones or anything else. It was just all going on in my head. So all the sort of like distractions and daydreams and imaginings and hypothetical things and imagining what, all kinds of stuff.
So I get that too. I have to remind myself sometimes that the thoughts in my head don't automatically translate onto my face.
Yeah.
And it's a conscious effort to show the emotion that I'm feeling on my face.
Yes.
And if you
I'd get the sort of Earth to Matthew sort of thing, and like people saying, are you there? Are you listening? And it's like, and sometimes, and what I still do, I can be in the queue at like Tesco Metro and not realise that, and someone will from behind will say it's your go and tut at you because you're just lost in a sort of like trance of the
So relatable, and it's almost quite sad because for us it can be very overstimulating sometimes, but sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's a huge amount of creativity that's going on in there. But because it isn't immediately obvious to other people in our immediate proximity, it can look like disengagement. It can look like laziness.
Yes.
And then you get comments like, stop being lazy, just pay attention.
Yeah.
And in fact, you are.
You are.
It's just so
and you've exerted so much energy by 10 a.m. that day. And then you're sort of like, you can be absolutely exhausted by lunchtime because you've basically, your brain's gone through like a week's worth of energy just by overthinking. But totally. And but it's a double-edged sword, isn't it? Because there's two sides to it. There is that side to it. And I know you've covered this a lot on your podcast as well, but there's also the focusing side. There's sort of like the hyper-focus, which I think without that, I'd find it very hard to write a novel. So with ADHD, I find it very hard to start a novel. But when I get an idea I'm really excited about, I can do nothing but that. So it's tricky, and it's tricky. I imagine in like a conventional work environment where you've got to have the right amount of productivity every single day. Like I'm a complete binger even with my work, so I'm totally all or nothing. I'll have weeks, months even without, with just a blank Word document and not being able to do anything and hating myself because I can't get started and I'm just on Instagram. And then when it clicks, normally when I'm away from a work environment and I get an idea, that's it. I'm just in and I just write. And I can be doing like 6,000 words a day or something. Just
yeah, no, it's very relatable. And getting over that procrastination hump, that version of Matt that knows you need to write, but for whatever reason you can't, compared to the version of Matt that is so hyper-focused that you can't stop. What's the difference between those two, and how do you think somebody could transition from one version of themselves to the other?
Well, this, I think, is where diagnosis helps so much, because it not only helps you, but if you live with anyone, it helps them and it helps people around you. So whatever their attitudes or however much stigma they have about it, or whether they believe in it or not, it gives you a legitimacy to be able to say, well, I've got this condition and this is, so there's certain things I can do. And you can explain to certain people that you're not rude, it's just this, or you're sometimes forgetful. And I think it's made me more productive in some ways knowing, because I then am more rigid about the things that I know make me feel better. So, for instance, going for a walk early in the day, having a routine, not being afraid to say no to things that I don't really want to do, and realizing it's not rudeness, but it's actual, self-care.
You've mentioned depression a couple of times, Matt, and as I said, I know it does heartbreakingly play a big part in your story. What do you think is the difference between depression, stress, and anxiety?
Stress is basically what a lot of us feel a lot of the time, where things are just slightly out of alignment and we're, running a bit behind, or, we've got too much on our plate and we're stressed about it. And stress is something that if that situation changed and if those emails, for instance, were answered, then the stress would go away. Stress is different to anxiety, because anxiety, for me, is when you've got proper capital A anxiety, you are suddenly in a state that you can't switch off. You are in it. And it doesn't necessarily matter if you took the immediate stressors away, you would find different stressors and be anxious about them. So you lose a bit of control. I think the difference between stress and anxiety is control. Anxiety and depression obviously can coexist and have done with me. For me, I can only speak for myself. Anxiety was always my trigger for depression rather than the other way around. So I would go through a period of anxiety, and then through sheer exhaustion, I'd reach a point which my brain sort of just fell into depression. And I think the difference between anxiety is thinking everything is going to get worse and worrying about that. And depression is the point beyond that at which you feel like you've given up, because you're at that point where everything is worse and there's no light at the end of the tunnel. And depression for me is being kind of trapped. You're kind of mentally trapped. You can't see a way out. And annoyingly, it doesn't matter how many times you fall in and out of depression. By its nature, when you fall into depression, you fall into that trap again and think, well, this time it's different. I won't get out of it. Or this time there really is no hope. Obviously, I spend a lot of my life and writing trying to sort of give people the idea that things change and situation changes. But I know how hard it is when you're depressed to see or imagine that light at the end of the tunnel.
Thank you for explaining that. We had Denise Welsh on, and she described depression as a complete void of emotion and feeling. It's almost like you've just given up. There's no sadness. It's not feeling anything.
Yeah.
As you said, you've gone past that, and it's almost you're just in a hole of no emotion. Would you agree with that? And why do you think it is so hard to describe depression to those nearest to you?
Yeah, it's sometimes that. I mean, I think because my depression always was with anxiety, my depression wasn't the stereotype of being like confined in bed and not being able to get up. So it was kind of like a fast forward depression. But for me, depression was an absence. It was an absence of hope. And also, it's not just a collection of thoughts. Like a lot of mental illness, it's not just a collection of thoughts. It's a total body experience. It makes you realize when you have it how connected the mind and body thing is, because you are feeling heavy. You're feeling like everything's an effort. You're feeling tired. There's a lot of physical symptoms, as with anxiety. So anxiety, you get a bit breathless, or if you're having a panic attack, your heart's racing. So too with depression, your muscles will ache. It's a proper physical mind-body nightmare that you're in. And when people doubt the severity or seriousness of it, I remind them that depression, not to be too depressing in saying this, but depression is the one illness that people unfortunately quite regularly choose to die because they have that illness. It's the sort of worst state. So for me, it was never a total void of emotion. It was just the sort of complete collapse, as kind of giving up under the weight of emotion, where hope disappears. But when you eventually, there's no better feeling, just as that's the worst feeling, there is no better feeling when your brain eventually disproves the depression because you've stayed around long enough. Like my brain at the age of, 25 years ago, at the age of 24, my brain told me I definitely wouldn't be alive at 25 years old. My brain told me by the end of the week I'd be in a straitjacket, that my girlfriend would leave me, that blah, blah, blah. It gives you the most pessimistic outlook. And so what happens if you stay around is you think, well, no, brain, actually, I am still alive at 25, so you were wrong about that. Or my girlfriend's still with me, or this is still happening. And so, yes, you were right about this thing, but you were wrong about this thing. And so part of my recovery was arguing with my own brain and being skeptical about the feelings it was giving me, which is itself exhausting because you're constantly having to sort of rationalize and reason with your own brain. But yeah.
Are you happy to talk about that stage in your life?
I'm so used to it now. 10 years ago, I wrote a book about that experience. I didn't think anyone would read that book. I was paid a lot less money to write that book. I was a novelist, and then I sort of like just thought I'd spend a couple of months writing this book for someone who might need it. I thought that would be the end of it, and I didn't think there'd be much to say beyond that. And then so for the last 10 years, because that book became my biggest book at that point, because it would be the one that everyone wanted to talk about, I've spoken so much about it that now I feel such distance to the younger me that I'm talking about that if I find it weird at all, it's just in that sense of detachment. Even though my mental health is definitely not perfect now and I still have depression, I'm talking about such a sort of clueless young man who didn't know he was neurodiverse, hardly could accept he was depressed, wouldn't have said he had a drink problem and drug problem and everything else. And there's such denial about so many things that I feel like I'm talking about a different person. And that's basically my point and what I say to people. Because the hardest question I was ever asked about depression was just from a random person at an event. And they said, well, you were lucky because you had a girlfriend, you had supported parents, you had a network around you. What would you say to the person who doesn't have anyone and they're suicidal and they're in that state? And I denied and did a really crap response, but I went away and thought about it. And I think who you're staying alive for, ultimately, yeah, of course, it helps. It helps to have support around you. But the real bastard thing about depression is anything good in your life, it can turn into a bad. It taints everything. So, for instance, having people who love you is a good thing. And with hindsight, I'm very grateful they were there. But at the time, it can make you feel like such a burden that you get this morbid voice, oh, they'd be better off without me. And so the good can become another reason to sort of end your life because you're feeling like you're weighing everyone down and this, that, and the other and stuff like that. But the person ultimately you stay around for, you stay around for the immediate people you have if you have them, but the ultimate person you stay around for is the person you're going to be beyond this. Because on a good morning or an average morning, I'm walking the dog and the sun comes out from behind a cloud, I'm just so grateful for every horrendous day I've managed to live through in my past that led to this averagely nice morning on planet Earth. You're grateful for going through it and you're grateful for being a different person. It's very hard in depression to feel like anything's going to change. But I'd say to someone who is in that state, if there's been a time in your life you felt differently, there can and will be a time in your life you feel different again. So do not throw an entire life away for what is a temporary state of mind.
It's great advice. And, horrifically and sadly, we know that within the ADHD community, you are 4 times more likely to take an attempt on your life. Your story is full of hope. People listening to you will see that you can go through really shit times and it will get better. If we, to lay the foundation, if you were to go back to that moment when, and do say if you don't want to go there, but when you were still on the edge of that cliff, Do you remember what was going through your mind? What could have been your final moments before you made that permanent decision?
Yeah, to be honest, it wasn't a very like philosophical, to be or not to be state of mind. I was in the depths of not only depression, but panic disorder. Everything was dysregulated. My body was dysregulated. This was in Ibiza. So I'd arrived in Ibiza 3 years before. I'd had all my sort of crazy times there. A lot of drink, a lot of cocaine, a lot of drugs, and just a lot of not sleeping, not eating well, not looking after myself, and just being caught up in the mayhem of Ibiza. But by the third summer, my girlfriend had a really good job. She was an office manager for the largest nightclub there. I had a less good job. I was selling tickets in a bar for nightclubs, getting free drinks all day, and trying to write little bits and pieces. And, but, it was relatively normal for the time. I think my trigger had been the fact that I was having to go back to London to try and get work. I'd had a disastrous winter before of not sustaining jobs. I just recently finished a master's degree and had stayed in academia for as long as I possibly could to put off growing up. And so I had adulthood looming, quarter-life crisis, years, as I say, of alcohol and cocaine. And it just exploded one morning, 11 a.m., had a panic attack that didn't end. And it was such a full-body, terrifying experience that, I couldn't keep food down, couldn't sleep. Was prescribed industrial strength diazepam, which just didn't really work. Spanish doctors didn't really understand what was going on. I just thought it was another Brit abroad on drugs. And I had a week of that. And by that point, I thought I cannot physically take this anymore. So it's not a death wish. The fear of death remains exactly the same as it is at any point. But the thing that's changed is that the pain of living has gone up so much that the balance is totally tilted. So a common sort of analogy is like the person in a burning building doesn't want to jump out the window and doesn't want to die, but they just don't want to face the flames. So when your mind turns on you to that extent, and when you're hallucinating, and when you're in a totally discombobulated state, you can't see a way out. I mean, it was impossible for me to read anything. I could hardly listen to anything. My girlfriend seemed so far away. It's such in a state of panic. And to reiterate again, this wasn't a bad trip. This was something that was just there, and it was permanent, and I didn't understand it. And again, this is why I think diagnosis of all kinds is so important, because I had no real understanding of myself. And when I was told by a doctor that I had depression and panic disorder, my mind just went. The famous people I knew who'd had depression were the famous suicides. So I was thinking of Kurt Cobain, thinking of like writers like Hemingway and Sylvia Plath and stuff, and famous. So I just thought, well, that's going to be me. That's just the path it is. And that's why I'm grateful that we're in a different time now. There's all kinds of problems in terms of mental health care and issues with waiting times and wrong diagnoses and wrong medications and wrong therapy and all of that. But what I'm grateful for about the times we're in is that stigma, not everywhere, not in every condition, but in terms of mental health and mental illness generally, has gone. And I think that's one thing. There's not many things to thank the internet for, but I think that is one place where it would have been easier for me if I'd have been able to sort of find other people going through this. Depression's quite melodramatic. I was literally thinking I was the only person who'd ever been through this. I mean, I'd never had a mate who'd talked about this. And I still didn't know how to talk to friends about it. I can remember when I went back to my parents' house and I was still in a critical, wanting to kill myself every day sort of state. A friend came round and said, "You look fine, let's just go to the pub." And I was like, I can't even go to the post box. I can't leave my house. I used to count progress in lampposts because I was agoraphobic for ages. So you'd have made it to 6 lampposts down your street, then that was a triumph. And and that feeling of being misunderstood even to yourself, like you're just a freaking alien, makes it all worse. So you become anxious about the anxiety, you become panicking about the panic, you're depressed about the depression. So you're in this kind of like weird postmodern sort of meta over-analysis of everything. And you're in this endless loop of your own head. So I think diagnoses help you understand. Like if I'd have known then about ADHD, I would have probably realized, and autism, I'd have probably realized that burnout was a major contributing factor. And that, yes, I'm going to be stuck in this state for a while, but it's not going to be a permanent state. If I manage to find a way to find some kind of recuperation, I'll get to a situation where I can be better and then try and avoid burning myself out. So knowledge would have been power, but I didn't have that. And because I'd had not a great experience on the medication I'd been given in Spain, I then became phobic about medication. And because I was agoraphobic about leaving the house, I didn't want to go to see a therapist. So I went the really long, hard way of, raw depression and panic for years, and incredibly lucky that I had Andrea by my side, my partner, who, she'd had no medical training or understanding of it. No one in her family had gone through what I'd gone through, but she just was there and I could talk to her and I wasn't worried about her leaving me at that point. And I was just very lucky. I mean, I'd have left me. So, you know what I mean? I was very difficult. And I'd gone from being one kind of nightmare boyfriend to the opposite kind of nightmare boyfriend. Before my breakdown, I was a nightmare because I was an addict who didn't realize I was an addict. I was, at that point in my life, I was full-blown alcoholic. I was in a bee for drinking all day from 11 in the morning till 3 in the morning. 11 in the morning till 3 in the morning. Often drugs involved as well. And our most frequent argument would be because I just wanted to stay out and have fun. And I basically was scared of going to bed and scared of my own mind and scared of sobriety. And, as a kid, I'd never been able to go to sleep very well. I'm still not a good sleeper. I'm not good at lights out. I want any stimulation until that moment you're left with your own head. And so when I didn't understand any of that, it was just vodka and Coke all the way. And so I went from being that boyfriend who wanted to be a party animal all the time, Gen X cliches, to couldn't go to the shop on my own, couldn't post a letter on my own, couldn't, if they needed Marmite, I couldn't do that on my own. It was like Indiana Jones and the Temple of Marmite. Everything was like an adventure. It was like the way I had to deal with agoraphobia was seeing it as like I was doing some incredible Mount Everest thing. So I tried to have a bit of like a sense of humor about it, a very dark humor, but that helped a little bit. But it was a long process of panic attacks on trains. We're talking years, but got there in the end. But your brain does change and it does adjust to things, but it takes a long time. And I genuinely think it would have been a shorter time if I'd have known the right things about my brain that I know now.
Focusing on that time, that horrendous time, there was obviously a thought process that thankfully stopped you from making that permanent decision. If you really zoom in on those particular thoughts, what is it about those thoughts? What have those thoughts taught you about life and the value of life?
Yeah. I mean, at that moment of being suicidal, you're not necessarily thinking of anything good about your life. But what I think I had enough of was a tiny belief in possibility that I wouldn't always feel like this. And I was a massive coward. You know, I was someone, and I'm thankful for being a coward, because I think if I'd been less of a coward, I'd have done it. But I was a massive coward. So I was almost like looking for reasons not to do it. And that's what I came up with about that. I just sort of felt something could be different. Now, in terms of like now, what I think depression's given me and what helps me now is that it's given me quite a lot. It's made life, it's made me appreciate things I'd never appreciated before. It's made me appreciate boring things and feeling bored and neutrality and conversations. And before I had a breakdown, I was classic young man who wanted extreme everything. So too much alcohol, too many drugs. Even if I was reading a book, it had to be the most extreme book. It had to be American Psycho, or it had to be something intense. Music had to be loudest. I was a raver. Had to just everything had to be loud. If I was going for a meal, I'd want a vindaloo or a madras, and I'd want it hot. And everything had, overstimulation.
All or nothing.
All or nothing in every sense. And I think going through all that, it made me appreciate everything. It made me appreciate, the taste of plain crisps, or, just my hometown. I always used to slag off my hometown where I grew up, which is Newark-on-Trent in Nottinghamshire, which when I grew up, it was quite a boring place. It didn't have a cinema, didn't have a bookshop, didn't have much culturally going on. But, after my breakdown, I went there and I'd see things in a different way, and I'd see my parents in a different way. And it just made you be grateful for being bored, because I'd had 3 years. The one thing I remember about wishing for with depression is you don't wish to be happy when you're depressed. You don't care less about happiness. Happiness is like an exotic, it's like going to Mars. It's just like so far away. What you want is to be bored. You want neutrality. You want to feel or go 10 seconds without thinking about your mind or depression. So I can remember the breakthrough moment wasn't a moment where I burst with happiness or I went on holiday or saw some sunshine. The moment I realized I could get better from depression was we were living in Leeds, me and my girlfriend. We'd moved from my parents' house to Leeds. And we were walking from the student area where we were renting to the city centre. And my girlfriend had pretty much single-handedly set up her own PR company with contacts she'd made in Ibiza and stuff, youth marketing and PR. And I was helping her a bit, and I was thinking about how to contact journalists. And I'd gone a whole minute of not thinking about depression, but thinking about writing an email, very boring email, to journalists about some client that my girlfriend had. But after I realised that I had a minute of not thinking about my own head, I thought, well, next time we can make it 2 minutes, we can make it 10 minutes. And then, maybe somehow normal life will start to seep in. Because what you wanted was to just forget about what you were feeling. And it's so hard with mental illness because mean, it can be hard with physical illness, but I mean, I'm someone who gets dogged by back pain, like a lot of people, but at least with back pain, you can point to your back and say, this is the problem. And it's something you psychologically think is separate to you, however much it dominates your thoughts. Whereas when the pain is your thoughts, it's like, where's the escape? You know, how do you rationalize yourself out of yourself? You know, so you want the opposite of thought. You want to just sort of like be not thinking. And and I suppose that suicidal impulse when it comes is kind of to escape the thoughts, to escape the heaviness that they give you. But yeah, it was very traumatizing. And I think, you know, obviously we were aware of like PTSD nowadays and trauma. But what I also think is mental illness itself can be trauma. So getting out of it can be very hard because every day you're waking up, you're remembering the trauma of yesterday. And so you're sort of trapped in a cycle where your brain's always echoing and fearing the worst it felt yesterday and sort of bringing that on. So yeah, it was a conundrum. And really, sometimes the only advice is the oldest advice and the most cliched advice. You know, it's just that time heals. Because if you stay around long enough, something shifts, something changes. And, you know, I'm someone talking with, you know, chronic conditions and conditions that I'll have forever, but perspective shifts. The way you see yourself shifts. Like, even in the realm of like ADHD or autism, you don't stop having that, but your perspective of it can change completely, your understanding of it, and your understanding of yourself and what's good for you and what's not good for you changes. And that's been a big part of my learning curve. Learning about a lot of the things my brain was attracted to were the very things that were terrible for my brain. So, you know, that quest for stimulation and distraction, which is a very ADHD quest, can be good, but it can be fatal. So it's like, the metaphor I always have for it is like a sailing boat in a storm. There's a lot of energy from the wind all around, and that can either be capsizing the boat and facing into the sails, or you can be speeding and get the wind in your sails and be using that energy if you get the right direction and if you angle the sails. But until you know your ADHD and until you know anything about yourself, you're left not knowing which direction to face the boat in.
The story of the email distracting you was quite painfully relatable. I often question my behavior and really study the motivation behind it. And I will clean my flat sometimes or my car, not because it's a mess, but to distract myself from the internal mess in my mind.
Yeah.
Doing stuff often for me physically that is working towards a goal that doesn't necessarily have to be completed the intention behind it will be to distract my brain, the internal mess. You know, you said that, and it really rung true. And you said earlier, you said you're scared of being sober, and obviously, I know that's in the past. But having been in AA myself, and you hear that so many people with ADHD and in meetings go through that phase where the thought of being sober is so terrifying because then you have to confront all the feelings. Then you have to confront and deal with the anxiety and go to therapy or deal with the depression. But simultaneously, the thought of staying drunk and continuing to drink is also terrifying because you now have enough evidence to know where that takes you.
Yes. People ask me how difficult, like the first time, because I'm sober now, I've been sober for 3 years, but after my breakdown, I was sober for 8 years. they used to ask me in that period, how did you stop drinking? Like, it was the easiest thing in the world to stop drinking because I became terrified of drinking. I was terrified of pills. I was terrified of drugs. So overnight, I stopped smoking. I stopped drinking. I never took a Class A substance again in my life from the age of 24. And it was easy. There was never a single temptation for a long time because I associated it with trauma. I associated it with pain. Ironically, all that stuff had been my self-prescribed medicine without realizing it was medication, but I was self-medicating. You know, I never liked smoking pot because it didn't make my brain feel good. But stimulants like speed and cocaine, I liked it because it temporarily made it regulate my brain. Obviously, in a very short space of time, it becomes very self-destructive. But I knew I was addressing an imbalance, but without the tools and education to do it, you're drawn to escaping your own brain. But as you say, you're right. You're then trapped because sobriety is what you're running away from, but also the pain of the stuff that alcohol and drugs give you. So you feel like between a rock and a hard place, and you can't see a way out. And you have, and I think a lot of therapy, like a lot of good therapy, stuff that's worked for me, is about being uncomfortable. I mean, when I first saw a therapist, I wanted the classic kind of like Freudian kind where everything's my mother's fault. I wanted to blame my mother. I wanted to blame everyone else. And obviously, you know, you have a bit of that talking about your childhood and where things come from. But after a while, you think, how is this helping me? You know, just knowing who else to blame for myself. What helped me was when I was starting to look at my own problematic behavior and not blaming other people for it, but actually going through discomfort. To make yourself feel better, you sometimes have to make yourself feel uncomfortable and face truths. I think a lot of people, certainly a lot of male people, we're quite bad at facing up to that. We mask it under booze, drugs, even under whatever it is culturally, like sport or whatever, you know, into distracting ourselves from the actual stuff that's going on. And it's uncomfortable. And I wouldn't have ever opted to do it, but I was kind of forced to do it by having a breakdown. But once you've done it, you've understood yourself better. It's like, I suppose, if life can be like listening to radio and you're not really understanding the radio because it's there. So if something goes wrong with the radio, you don't know anything about it. But if you have a breakdown, it's like breaking the radio and you're seeing, you know, the transistor or whatever parts make up the radio. And so you know how the radio works. So you have an understanding if the radio goes wrong of how to fix the radio. So breakdowns are not fun, but like everything else in life, they're a learning experience.
You mentioned you were terrified. You're terrified of drinking again because you associate drinking with trauma. Out of all the people I know that have been sober for a long time, they almost have that in common. Drinking took them to such a terrible place that is their main motivator now. And the people that I know who didn't go to a dark place and have tried to stay sober, they rarely achieve it. Do you think it is a necessity to go to such a dark place, and we call it a rock bottom, in order to maintain sobriety after it?
Yeah, I wish it wasn't like that. But for me, that has been the case. And I've always felt like the way you beat a demon is to find a bigger demon. The way you beat a monster is to find a bigger monster. So at one point in my life, going outside was a monster because every time I went outside, I had a panic attack. And so it wasn't a fear of outside. It was a fear of what would happen when I'm outside. And what would happen would be this biochemical change in me where I'd have this flood of panic. And, certainly if it was going to like shops or busy areas or trains, I'd just have a horrendous panic attack, which wasn't just a panic attack in the moment. It just exhausts you and depress you for days afterwards. So you end up wanting to stop going outside. The thing that got me back to going outside was I didn't want to be I'm going to use like politically incorrect language now, but I didn't want to be like a mad agoraphobic person. But this is just how I was thinking at the time. I didn't want to be Howard Hughes, or I didn't want to be the sort of like, inverted commas, crazy person inside. So I had this cliched idea of where I'd end up. And that stopped me. That forced me to sort of like go outside and go through the panic attacks. And I think when I kind of needed to get scared of alcohol and drugs to stop doing them. I often wonder in the parallel life where I didn't have complete over-the-top breakdown, whether, I'd have stayed depressed without really realizing I was depressed, and stayed drinking and smoking and doing drugs and all that stuff. And I'm not, I'm definitely not part of like a modern day temperance society who judges other people for drinking. And I wish I was a more moderate person who could just enjoy a glass of red wine. But I find it easier, and I think this is an ADHD thing, I find it easier not having a choice. Like, I have tried in my more recent past to be a moderate drinker, but I can't do it. And it's stressful because you'll go out with friends and you've got a constant decision. Shall I look slightly rude or awkward and get a ginger beer, or shall I just have a drink? And if you are, so it's easier for me to just say I don't drink because I'm an alcoholic. I can't. And then that's easier. I don't even know if technically I'm an alcoholic, but it's easier to say I'm an alcoholic because then I don't have to drink. And
yeah, I mean, hearing you say that, it really hits home so hard. I'm very much the same in terms of, I don't want to put words into your mouth, but if I have one drink, the brakes are off.
Yeah.
I can't just have one. I can't sip. I down. And if I have one glass of wine, I have a bottle, and then I have two. I cannot drink normally. And that moment I had that realization.
At your worst, how much were you drinking a day, if you don't mind?
Oh, at my worst, 3 bottles of wine.
Yeah.
It was the time that it took to do that, which was the concerning thing. It wasn't like that was from 8 a.m. till 8 p.m. Yeah. That was within about 2 hours. So it was very much like as soon as I had my sip, the brakes were off, and I had no idea how that would end.
No.
It ended in hospital lots of times. It ended in the back of a police car once, ambulance other times. I lost control as soon as I had that first sip. Yeah.
Yeah, 3 bottles of wine. In Ibiza, I used 3 bottles of Vinyasol, and And so even when you wake up the next day, you're not in a good state, are you? Because you're just feeling dreadful. But about that thing as well, about needing something that stops you. That's always been a pattern. I've always needed to sort of like get in trouble for something to stop it, which is terrible. But like, I was a compulsive shoplifter and I got arrested at the age of 16, but I'd had 5 years of compulsive shoplifting to the extent that I'd choose to go to the supermarket with my mum on a Friday night and she'd think I was really helpful. And I'd just be behind like in the pick and mix or Turkish Delight, just like slot it in.
I'm fascinated. What was your brain getting from shoplifting? What was it giving you?
I'm not saying this in a sort of Buddhist way, but I'm generally not a materialist person. So I've never been bothered about things. So it was never about the things I was stealing. It was about the stupid little hit of adrenaline as you walk through the door out. And I got cocky with it, and I did it in Boots, which was a really bad idea because they've got a lot of plain clothes people. And so I was showing off with my friends, and had a crunchy bar and this dates it, but some wet look hair gel.
I remember. Still rock solid.
Yeah, but it's something the opposite, because it then just like dry on you. And that's what I got caught for. And so I had a few hours in a police cell. I wasn't so bothered about the police cell, but I was bothered about the fact that they'd called my mother because I was 16. I think they still call your mum. And anyway, so I got off with a caution, but I didn't shoplift again. But it was annoying that you need a police cell before you stop, and or a breakdown, and I have no idea if I'd have known certain things, or if I'd have been put on different tablets or ADHD medication as a teenager or something, if things would have been different, but they wouldn't have been worse. You know what I mean? So some things would have definitely been better, because I think that feeling of feeling different, if you have, people moan about everyone having a label these days, but I still think we're underdiagnosed. I mean, I was one of those really annoying people post-diagnosis where my biggest symptom was diagnosing everyone else, diagnosing my entire family, and, seeing a lot of traits. They're probably not all ADHD, but there's definitely people, certainly of the generation older than mine and my own generation, that have stuff that they've had all their life and caused all sorts of problems and carnage, and it's never been addressed because they've not been diagnosed. So I hate all that talk about underdiagnosis. I'm sure there's a lot of misdiagnosis, but there's a lot of misdiagnosis full stop across the health spectrum. With physical health, there's a lot of misdiagnosis all the time. But I think generally most people are probably underdiagnosed for whatever they've got going on.
With what we were talking about earlier about addiction and perhaps having to go to that really dark and often dangerous place before you can create that phobia of the thing you're addicted to, and with addiction often being genetic, and you mentioned again there you're a parent, does that worry you?
What, in terms of them becoming addicted to things, or in terms of diagnosis? I mean, we know my son is autistic. He had the ADHD assessment. He's not ADHD, but he's autistic, and we homeschool him because, we don't homeschool him because he's autistic, because he's been homeschooled before that, but the reason he couldn't function in school properly was probably neurodiversity. So I've had all kinds of worries and concerns, and even before he had a diagnosis, when my career suddenly became talking about my mental health all the time, I was worried that was like a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy, that he'll feel like his, but I kind of wished when I was younger and ill that I wished in a way my parents had been a little bit more open with me about what they'd gone through. I remember an incredibly cathartic moment happened a lot later when my mum, it was quite an emotional thing, and I don't even know if I should have read it, but she let me read her diary of when I was a baby, and she'd gone through postnatal depression. And she's never been diagnosed with neurodiversity, but there's some sort of difference there. But anyway, this diary about how, how difficult she found having me and my sister was incredibly painful to read, but incredibly, she was so honest on the page of her diary that she'd never quite been to her face, but she wanted me to read the diary, which I think was a very loving gesture, actually, because it, opened up a lot of things. And about her fear. What it was is she had a total fear of being a mother because she didn't think she was able to be a mother. So there'd be days she'd have to call my dad home from work because she was worried she was going to do something. Like, you know, she wasn't going to do something, but it was that postnatal depression feeling of, oh, what if I put him in the washing machine or something? So she had that going on. And reading all that stuff was very emotional, but it was very therapeutic as well. And it made me wish I'd known a lot of it earlier, because if I'd have known my mum went through like 5 years of quite severe depression and got through it, that would have been very helpful. So, you know, in terms of my own kids, I think, you know, this generation coming up have all kinds, you know, there's a mental health epidemic obviously going on and all kinds of things happening and problems they're facing. And you can't protect them forever from that. But what you can do is be as open and honest about how you've dealt with things. And so that's what I've tried to do. Obviously, there's a language around it, just as there would be around physical illness or whatever it is. But I've tried to talk age appropriately through their life about stuff.
It's a conversation I have with myself sometimes. You know, if I had kids, and the awareness that addiction and these neurodivergent conditions are often appear to be genetic, and to know that you have to, I would have the conversation with them, but simultaneously I would have to almost let them tread their own path and learn those lessons for themselves. And I can't imagine anything more terrifying than knowing that your kid is going through that journey.
Yeah. But the things I'm proudest of, like, with my son, I mean, my daughter hasn't been diagnosed as neurodiverse. There's lots I'm proud of my daughter as well. But the things I'm proud of with my son are often not despite his autism. It's because of his autism. Like a lot of teenage boys, he plays video games. But he doesn't just play video games. He can name you the first 10 video games that were ever invented. He will tell you the entire history of Rockstar Games. He will tell you everything you could possibly know about Grand Theft Auto, every single game, and you know, the history of gaming, the culture of it. He will bore you senseless with it. But I'm so proud that he's able to be that in depth on things. And you know, when he was younger, he used to write stories about our dogs. And I'd be there sort of struggling to write like 1,000 words a day. And I'd look at his word count and he's done like 30,000 words as a 9-year-old on some. So, you know, and so it's the quirks you love about people. And so I think that's what I'd love young people to have, is that, you know, like, it's the difference. As you get older, you appreciate not the things that are similar to other people, but the things that make you different to other people. As a teenager, where you're wanting to assimilate, that can be hard. But it's those things that when you find someone who loves you, that they'll love you even more because of that difference, because that's what makes you you. And so, yeah, embrace that difference as early as you can. I was, as I say, I was very late to do that, or to accept myself. And, you know, I was a very self-conscious person, partly because I felt different and didn't know why. So I must be a weirdo. You know, the year before my breakdown, as well as having these sort of like bad jobs I didn't like, I was also applying to work in advertising. And I can remember going to Soho, and I just was too scared to actually ring the buzzer for the interview. Because I just didn't believe in myself. And I think this generation growing up is a little bit better at that. I think they're a little bit better at embracing their difference and their identities in a way that in the 80s and 90s felt impossible.
Embracing your differences, I mean, it's such a powerful and important message, and really one of the key motivations to produce this podcast. To highlight the many positives that come with a neurodivergent brain. Looking back through my journey, and many people I've spoken to, it was the moment that they stopped trying to be normal was when they really started to thrive. And the trajectory of So many things change. Their mental health, their career progression.
Yeah. Yeah, totally. And I think I'm quite lucky in that I'm a writer. So I don't have that pressure of like fitting into an office situation. And you kind of, if you're a writer or an artist or a musician, you expect it to be a bit weird. And it like helps. So that's been lucky. But yeah, definitely. And I think creatively embracing that side of you leads to more creativity. So if you're doing something creative and you've got that outlet, if you embrace your weirdness and not see it as weirdness and just go with it, then yeah. And looking at things a different way can be infuriating and exhausting, but it also can give you many, many things. And I certainly, if there was a button to press to be instantly neurotypical, I would never press that button. I'm very, because you'd literally be pressing a button to be someone who isn't you. And what's the point of you're alive as you, and through the sheer randomness of the universe, you might as well be the most you version of you. There's no point being someone else because they already exist. So.
Yeah, I mean, it's a powerful message. And with regards to everything we've spoken about today, your mental health, how are you managing today?
Today is pretty good. As I told you before we started, I had a little bit of travel situation. You're used to Brighton to London trains, and so I get very stressed about that. And I nearly missed my stop at East Croydon because I was distracted by social media. But no, it's not too bad actually, because I had a nice long walk on Brighton Beach this morning, and yeah, my big thing at the moment is that I'm in a massive procrastination patch because I'm meant to be getting on with a novel about I'm not managing to write. So we're getting quite deep into the year now, and I haven't actually done anything I would call proper work. Can I call this proper work, Alex? I feel like, can we call this proper work? Yeah, but no. Yeah, today's a good day, though.
Good. Are you quite kind to yourself when you're in these phases where you just don't do much productive?
I'm getting better. I'm getting better now. I know I'm ADHD. But I have to berate myself a little bit to actually get anything done. So I go through this patch. But I've written something like 26 books now, and I realize this is just a process. It's not being the process. That blank Word document is the process. Me having to sort of like go around and waste time on thinking of other things is the process. So I'm a bit kinder to myself about it, yeah. But it can be exhausting.
Just finally, Matt, if you were to thank depression, what would you thank it for?
I would thank depression for making me face things that I wouldn't have faced. I'm honestly, I hate depression, and there will be a time in my life, I'm sure, when I have depression again. And it's always there. Once you've had it, it's always there. But I wouldn't opt to not have had it, to not have gone through hell, to not have been suicidal, because it has given me so much in terms of life. When I was sort of studying art history at university, I'm going to be really pretentious now, but there's an art term called chiaroscuro, which is contrast, light and shade in a painting. So like in a Renaissance painting, you'd have Virgin Mary and surrounded by darkness to make the Virgin Mary or John the Baptist look spiritual and wonderful. And so like I see the depression as the sort of darkness, and everything about life outside of that becomes lighter and more brilliant. And if you felt like it was impossible to get out of depression, impossible to live, and you do that, then you think, oh, I can do other impossible things. I can write a book. I get married to the woman I love, or I can do this, or I can do that. And so it gives you, overcoming depression gives you a belief in doing anything you think of that's impossible.
Yeah. It's a super powerful message, Matt, to end on. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
I did say finally, but there is one more bit I want to do,
Okay.
which I normally do in the middle, but we really
Go for it.
flowed through that, it's called the ADHD agony art section.
Oh, yeah.
Every week I ask the ADHD chatter community to send in their woes,
Yes.
ADHD woes. It's all very fun and games, this podcast. This is very positive.
A washing machine of whoa.
And it goes in a washing machine because my ADHD item is a washing machine because I always leave my laundry in the machine. So I have to ask. I ask everyone: do you leave your laundry in the machine?
Yes, and I'm terrible at dishwashers, washing machines. I have a complete floor-drobe, and this is a source of marital strife and discomfort in our relationship because but at least now, we've switched the argument from me being sexist. I can be like, it's just ADHD, but I'm trying to be better.
Yeah, so that when you hear the beeping and it's your turn to take over from the machine. It's like, I've got to empty the dishwasher. But yeah, every week, somebody in the ADHD chatter community sends in their woes. It goes in the washing machine.
Right.
And I read out a woe to the guest to see if there is some wisdom. I am getting slightly better. I have to always remember to say this because I'm using the Tiimo app, which is the sponsor of the show.
Oh, yeah.
But ever since I've started using them, it's not perfect, but I'm getting better. This week, Matt, in the washing machine of woes, someone's asked, my best friend feels very lost. She has ADHD and suffered from addiction most of her life and even tried to take her own life once before. I think she's getting better, but I feel like it's only a matter of time before something happens and she might try again, which is awful as I can't always be there for her. Do you have any advice as to what I can tell her to help?
Yeah, I mean, there's two things there. A feeling like that massive sense of responsibility that the person?
My best friend, she has ADHD, yes.
Oh, yeah, so the person actually has ADHD. Yeah, it's a tricky one. I feel like it's very difficult, especially when addiction is involved, to know how to be there for somebody because very often the person involved doesn't want anyone to be there for them. So it's about making yourself visible to that person, understood by that person. And, there's a tendency when someone's going through like a crisis to say, I'll leave them to it. And obviously this person's not got that tendency, but that's a dangerous tendency. I think it's just about being there and, saying that it's not always going to be like this. And addiction is something that is very common with ADHD, but it doesn't have to be a permanent feature of ADHD. And it's sort of going back to that thing about being there for someone. I think with addiction, it's about trying to find something else, isn't it, in your life that fills that. Because, it's difficult. But as a friend of that person, you just have to show that you're there and you're willing. But that person himself has to realize that there's only so much you can do for that person when they're in that state. Because I think that was the frustrating thing for my partner when I was going through that, is they were saying all the right things, but it ultimately had to be me who made the decisions and who changed my life. And unfortunately, there's no magic way of reaching in. So, don't bear that responsibility too much, but just be there as much as you can.
Wow. Thank you, Matt. It's such a sensitive conversation and not something I know huge amounts, so I don't want to say too much. I know we've had a couple of guests on who have been through that terribly dark time similar to yourself, and they reported feeling during that time actually very happy, almost because they had finally found a solution to their problems. And I don't know if is there a feeling of contentment, or at least some version of peace, if someone is at that stage where they are thinking of making that permanent decision?
It's it's a very distorted kind of peace. It's kind of like, I can remember, well, as I say, it's that feeling of not having any escape can make you suicidal. So you finally found an escape, and it's sort of nice to know the sort of like fire exit to life is there, but it's also terrifying as well. And it's so important to realize my favorite word in the English language is a really non-poetic, sciencey word, but neuroplasticity. The fact that our brains physically change structure. It's used a lot in the realm of Alzheimer's research, but it's increasingly used with neurodiversity, mental illness. Our brains change. So when we sort of say as a figure of speech, we're not the same person we were 10 years ago, we're really not the same person we were 10 years ago. Every interaction we do, every person we meet, every time we move to a different location, our brain responds to stimuli and changes structure. So embracing that concept that you can actually change who you are. As someone who's an addict myself, as someone who's had suicidal depression myself, that's a life-saving idea to hold on to, the idea that you won't be this person. You literally won't be this person. Someone else will eventually show up that is related to this person, but is in a totally different state and in a totally different position in life. So it's back to that thing of staying around for who you're going to be. And that, if you're dealing with someone, to try and make them realize that they haven't always been this addicted to what they're addicted to. They haven't always been this depressed about life. And, there will come another time. But it can be very hard to get that message through. But it's one that I try myself to get through. And when I wrote Reasons to Stay Alive, that I was deliberately using very simple language, because it can be so hard in the state of depression to get through to someone. And when you combine anxiety, ADHD and everything as well, to actually get them to focus on it. So that was the challenge I've had when I'm speaking and writing about mental health, is to, how do you say it clearly? How do you get through? And ultimately it comes down to being as simple as, this will change. You will not always feel like this. Your brain will literally change. And you just have to hold on. And the metaphor as well for depression that I like is the one about the sky. Because people always talk about depression being a cloud. So if that is the metaphor of having a dark cloud, you in that metaphor are the sky. So seeing the mind as weather makes things a lot easier. You might be in a climate where it's cloudy a lot of the time, but those clouds will shift around and lighten and the sun will come out. And so you just have to wait for the weather to change. So however big your problems feel, you are always bigger than your problems, because you're the one containing your problems, just as the sky contains the cloud. So it's believing in that bigness and not believing the lies that depression says about your present and your future, and that it is everything, because it's not everything. It feels like everything, just the way a physical pain can feel like everything, but it's not, and it will change and it will shift.
There's a lot of powerful messages in there, Matt. Somebody else will eventually show up, you said. I think that's a powerful statement to end on.
Thank you. Yeah, I hope so. And It's been very good chatting to you, Alex. It's been really...
Likewise, Matt. Honestly, it's been an absolute joy. And thank you again for giving up your time to come here this evening. We have a closing tradition on the podcast, and that is to deliver a letter to you that has been written by the previous guest.
Oh, okay.
The previous guest, and hopefully later on you'll do the same.
Yes.
You'll write 3 rules to live by.
Right.
And the previous guest put it in that postbox. But through the magic of time travel and editing, I'll deliver you the previous guest's letter. And if you could kindly open it and read the 3 rules.
Yes, I will. Okay. Don't care about what people say about you. They will say this no matter which... I needed my glasses. I needed my glasses. What was that first one? I bet I'll read it once you tell me.
Shall I read the... Do you want your glasses or shall I read them?
No, I haven't got... My glasses are 100 miles away in Brighton. So.
Oh, I see. Right. I'll start it. Don't care about what people say about you. They will say this no matter what. Make your own direction and find your own way. That was the first one. The second one, believe in your strengths, pursue what you are passionate about, you'll do wonders.
Right.
And the third one, very simply, different is beautiful.
Different is beautiful. Yes, I like that. It's a hard thing to learn, that one.
As I said, Matt, this is, I mean, it took an interesting turn. I wasn't expecting to really focus on some of the dark topics that we did.
Yeah, sorry, I've turned it into...
No, I'm so pleased that we did. The way these all conversations organically go, I always lean into them. And it's such a big...
I thought you were my therapist for a little while halfway through that, and I remembered.
It's been, honestly, Matt, thank you again on behalf of everyone listening, and it's been an honour and a pleasure to interview you. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Alex.